We will now discuss the sticky prices and sticky wages models. We start with the sticky prices model, which is also called the New Keynesian model. In the last decades, this model has turned into the workhorse model that is used by central banks all over the world as a guiding tool to evaluate the impact of monetary policy on the economy. The New Keynesian model, just like the price misperception model, essentially adds frictions to the real business cycle model that are relevant in the short run, but that are irrelevant in the long run. However, now the friction is not on acquiring information, but rather on adjusting prices. That is, we now assume that it is costly to adjust prices in the short run. In order to have sticky prices, that is, nominal prices that do not react fast enough to changing economic conditions, the model relies on two main ingredients that are needed. Number one, firms must have some sort of market power to be able to set prices. But second, at the same time they face costs when they decide to adjust prices. These costs are often called menu costs. This is based on the example that when a restaurant decides to change its prices, it must pay the cost of producing new menus. Note that even for firms that can post all prices online, there are costs that they face when they adjust prices. It still takes time, which is costly, to update prices. Now, to theoretically support the ability of firms in setting their own prices, we assume that firms operate under imperfect competition. Hence, we expect now firms to have positive profits in equilibrium. How does the price setting work under imperfect competition? We assume each firm produces a slightly different variety of the final good that households consume. Households treat this variety as substitutes. Hence, even though there is only one firm producing one specific variety, the firm faces competition from other varieties of the final good. This setup is called monopolistic competition. As the name indicates, and as explained before, each firm is a monopoly over its own variety, but at the same time faces competition from other varieties. We assume there are uppercase J firms, which also means uppercase J varieties. Let Pj be the price charged for a variety by firm J, and the quantity demanded for that variety be Ydj. We can get our main results by assuming that the quantity demanded Ydj will depend on the ratio between Pj and the average price P. If Pj is high relative to the average price, consumers will then consume less of that variety and will demand relatively more of other cheaper varieties. Finally, if income increases, then demand for all varieties increases. Each firm will maximize profits, where now there is a possibility of setting both price and production. Being a monopolist, each firm will maximize profits by setting price above marginal cost of production. The ratio between the price Pj and the marginal cost of production, W over marginal productivity of labor for firm J, is called the markup. The less competition each firm J faces from other varieties, the higher will be its ability to place price above marginal cost, and therefore the higher will be the markup. So each firm will set prices by adding a markup to the marginal cost, which will determine the profit margin of the firm. That is, Pj will be equal to the markup times W over firms J's marginal productivity of labor. This means that if firms face cost pressure, they will increase prices accordingly in order to maintain the markup and hence profits at the desired level. Now, given this setup, let's discuss how money affects the economy. Consider doubling the amount of M in the economy. For the money market to clear, we would have to see that the average price P doubles. But if P doubles, all firms would have to double prices so that the quantity demanded is still the same. Now, since production is still the same, firms will have the same demand for labor. To guarantee that, nominal wages will have to double as well, so that the real wage offered is still the same in equilibrium. As a result, money neutrality still holds. So imperfect competition by itself is not enough to break money neutrality. we need price stickiness. Let's then assume that indeed it is costly to adjust prices. Let us consider an extreme case where it is so costly to adjust that no firm adjusts prices in the short run. Then, the average price will also be fixed in the short run. If P is constant and we still see M doubling, we have that the real money balances will double. This excess of real money balances will be converted into savings and consumption, as households have no reason to hold these excess real money balances. Hence, as part of the real money balances are spent on goods, each firm will experience an increase in the quantity demanded of its good. Even though prices are fixed, the firm have an incentive to meet the extra demand over some range. In order to raise production to meet the extra demand, firms will have to hire extra labor, which will imply in higher marginal costs. With prices fixed and an increase in marginal cost, we have that the markup falls in the short run. That is, total profits increase by producing the extra quantity demanded, and that is why firms have an incentive to do it in the first place, but average profit, defined as profits divided by total output, falls. As a result, production increases through increases in labor input, and we therefore have that monetary expansion is non-neutral in the short run. So now we have that business cycles can be originated from monetary shocks. We now show diagrammatically the mechanisms we just described in the labor market. When M rises, households demand more goods, and since firms have an incentive to meet this extra demand, they will want to hire more workers given the same real wage. As a consequence, the labor demand curve shifts to the right, which together with the fact that labor supply is still the same, implies that real wages and hours worked will both rise in equilibrium. As you can see, the predictions of the new Keynesian model are the same as the price misperception model in terms of real GDP, Y, and labor input, L. However, while the price misperception model predicted that real wage would fall, the new Keynesian model predicts that the real wage rises in equilibrium. Therefore, the new Keynesian model predicts that real wages are also pro-cyclical. However, we see that in the new Keynesian model, the marginal productivity of labor falls as L rises without any change in technology. Hence, the new Keynesian model predicts that labor productivity is counter-cyclical. This last prediction, as we will see shortly, does not align well with the data. However, economists have used the idea of labor hoarding to make labor productivity pro-cyclical in the new Keynesian model. Now, in the long run, eventually, firms will have that the cost of not adjusting prices, which are related with the markup being below the optimal level, will outweigh the menu costs, and firms will thus start adjusting prices. As prices start adjusting, the average price starts rising, which makes the real money balances, M over P, start decreasing back to its original level. Moreover, as M over P falls, so does demand for goods, which makes also firms want to hire less. Hence, the demand for labor curve will start moving to the left towards its original position. The real wage in equilibrium also falls to its original value, which means nominal wage also have to increase as the average price P increases. As a result, in the long run, all real variables go back to their original value. Our conclusion is that the real effects of monetary policy shocks only happen in the short run and disappear in the long run. Hence, money neutrality still holds in the long run in the new Keynesian framework. In this table, we show the data observations together with the prediction of the real business cycle model when fluctuations in GDP Y are explained by TFP shocks, and with predictions of the price misperception and the new Keynesian models when economic fluctuations are driven by monetary shocks. What we can see is that the real business cycle model appears to be the most successful model in accounting for the data. However, does this necessarily mean that monetary policy shocks are not relevant? Not at all. If both shocks hit the economy at the same time, all the time, it only means that TFP shocks are more dominant. Moreover, the data observations are for all cycles. However, there might be some recessions where the impact of monetary policy shocks was more important. In other words, it is important to look as well at conditional moments of the data. An interesting feature of the new Keynesian model is that output becomes partially demand determined. We saw that an increase in demand through increases in money balances generates more output. However, in fact, any increase in aggregate demand will generate more output. A prime example is whenever the government exogenously increases spending. Another is when households suddenly change their savings consumption decision because of higher uncertainty or other factors. Now, since more output means more income, and since more income generates more demand, this feature also implies that changes in aggregate demand will have some sort of a multiplier effect on output. In fact, it is perfectly possible to have Y increasing by more than the initial increase in aggregate demand. That is, it is possible for the multiplier to be above 1. The successive rounds of demand generating more output, that in turn generate more demand, always end, and we do not have an explosive behavior. And the reason for that is that at each round of additional output, not all extra income gets spent. Some of it is saved. Hence, after a couple of rounds, eventually these effects are basically zero. We now turn into how monetary policy works in practice. The first thing that is important to note is that in practice, the central banks implement monetary policy through changes in target interest rates rather than targets for monetary aggregates. If P is fixed, in the very short run, think 1 day, the money market clearing tells us that the central bank, by changing M, has full control over the nominal short-term interest rate. Milton Friedman advocated that the central banks should target the money aggregates. This would only work well if the demand for money is stable. If, however, the money demand is hard to predict, then it could well be that increases in the money supply could actually turn out to increase the short-term interest rate rather than decreasing it. This could happen because money demand could have increased by more than what the money supply increased. Hence, even though the central bank initial intention was one of monetary expansion, it could turn out that the actual policy was one of monetary contraction. So it turns out that the demand for money is indeed much more volatile than what Friedman had anticipated. Hence, nowadays, central banks prefer to target the interest rates directly, and then change the money supply accordingly until the market short-term interest rate hits the target. The short-term interest rate the central bank targets is the overnight interbank interest rate. That is, it is the rate banks charge each other when a bank needs to borrow to close the accounts at the end of the day with the minimum required reserves and pays the loan the next day. This rate serves as an anchor to all other interest rates, because as the interbank interest rate changes, the cost of financing of the banks change, and as a consequence, this cost is pushed to all other financial operations of the bank. In other words, when the bank had to pay more for financing its operations, it will also charge more when lending to consumers and firms. Before the Great Recession in 2008, the conventional way in which monetary policy was implemented was with open market operations. That is, the way in which the central banks controlled the interbank rate was through purchases and sales of treasury bills. If the central bank wanted to lower the interbank rate, it would buy treasury bills, thus providing extra liquidity to the banks, which would then alleviate financial needs, which would then translate into lower interbank rates. If the central bank wanted to raise the interbank rate, then it would sell treasury bills, thus taking out liquidity of the banking system. This is what we call conventional monetary policy. To avoid uncontrolled volatility in the interbanking loan market, the central banks in the US and in the euro area use what is called a corridor system. That is, on top of the target for the interbank rate, central banks also provide a floor and a ceiling for this market rate. How is that central bank can enforce a ceiling and a floor for the interbank rate? By using the marginal lending facility rate and the deposit facility rate. But what are these rates? The marginal lending facility rate is the rate in which banks borrow from the central bank. Hence, there will never be a bank that will be able to charge more than this rate, because if they do so, no bank will borrow from it. They would just rather borrow directly from the central bank. Hence, the marginal lending facility rate establishes a ceiling to the interbank rate. Now, the deposit facility rate is the rate that the central bank pays the banks for their excess reserves. Again, no bank would ever charge less than this rate in the market, because if a bank asks for a lower rate than this, the bank will just rather lend the money to the central bank. After the Great Recession, though, things changed. With quantitative easing, there was an unprecedented increase in liquidity in the banking system because of the large-scale purchases of assets by the central bank. Hence, as shown in the figure, banks now live in a world with excess liquidity, and as a consequence, the interbank rate is always extremely close to the deposit facility rate, the floor. So now instead of a corridor system, we have a floor system. Now, can the central bank still increase the short-term interest rate without scaling down quantitative easing? The answer is yes. By increasing the deposit facility rate, so now the central banks have more independent tools, quantitative easing and short-term interest rates, than before to conduct monetary policy. We will now turn to the sticky nominal wage model. This model is more closely inspired by John Maynard Keynes' original work. His observation was that the extremely high and persistent unemployment during the Great Depression had to be caused by some failure in the wage adjustment of the labor market. That is, due to wage stickiness, wages were above the market clearing level, and hence we observed high unemployment. So that in equilibrium, there were workers that would be willing to work for lower wages, but since wages were failing to adjust, in this case to lower, workers were kept involuntarily unemployed. This figure shows exactly the situation I just described. Keynes proposed two ways to decrease unemployment in this environment. One was through monetary policy. So if M rises, then according to the money market, P will rise and the real wage will fall, allowing workers to become employed. Hence, the prediction would be that labor input L would increase in equilibrium, and so would output. So M and L would both be pro-cyclical, just as in the new Keynesian model. The difference is that, again, the real wage would be counter-cyclical, which is counterfactual. Finally, another proposal of Keynes was to increase government spending G. Higher G would make firms want to hire more labor, thus expanding the labor demand curve. This means that L would rise in equilibrium and also output. One last point about the sticky wage model is that long-term contracts, which can explain why wages are sticky, do not necessarily mean that they will lead to unemployment and underproduction as it appears in the Keynesian model. At any point in time, the economy has an array of existing labor contracts, each of which can have a higher wage than the market clearing value and others below. There would need to be a major event to suddenly push all wages to be above the market clearing wage.